Purgatory Theory. Ed and Eddie. Purgatory Theory.
This line stood out to me the first time I played Deltarune Chapter 4. Maybe it's just meant to be flavor text. Maybe it's just Susie commenting on how weird Kris is again. But it just felt to me like a very odd thing to remark on. If Kris is always carrying that knife, then why doesn't it show up in our inventory? And why doesn't it transform into anything when Kris enters a dark world? We see Kris and Susie's clothes transform, and the items they're carrying will turn into Dark World equivalent items. But Kris's knife, which, as Susie points out, Kris is always carrying, is the only thing in the game with no Dark World equivalent. There's nothing in the Dark World that Kris's knife could be. Except for maybe one thing. I believe the so-called Roaring Knight that we fight at the end of Deltarune Chapter 3 is Kris's knife. I firmly believe this. I believe there is enough evidence in the game to support it being the case, that I think in the very least it is a strong possibility. In this video, I'm not going to attempt to disprove Death Knight or Carol Knight or any other knight. I'm not supplying evidence to the contrary of any of those theories. My only goal is to present the evidence I've compiled that Knight Knife, Knight Knife has genuine credence. As soon as I started looking for it, I found so much stuff in the game to back this theory up that I'm genuinely shocked I've never seen anyone else present it as a possibility before. In Chapter 4, when the Fun Gang confronts the quote-unquote Roaring Knight, something else Susie says, which I think is also a very significant line, is that it's possible the Roaring Knight can't fight Kris or Susie in the real world. That could be because they're like Dess's shambling dead body. Or another possibility is that the Roaring Knight is a Darkener. Susie was right, they don't have the ability to fight Kris and Susie in the real world because in the real world they're an inanimate object. Okay, moving on from 2 lines of Susie dialogue, let's look at the design. The Roaring Knight. God, bro, I'm like staring at it right now and I'm so convinced I'm right about this. Fuck, I'm so sure I'm right. The Roaring Knight is a single shape. It's a white outline and a black interior. Like how the blade of a knife is one uniform color with a kind of brighter edge. The sword that they wield in battle grows out of them like it's a piece of them. The design is comprised entirely of like sharp, angular lines, like points. Every single piece of them, every part of their body looks like a blade. Something I noticed very recently was that Kris's knife in the Light World, it has a cross-shaped hilt. That's something that's also present in the Roaring Knight's design. I mean, if you look at them upside down, they kind of look like a knife with a cross-shaped hilt. The horns on their head are the same shape too. During the Roaring Knight's final attack, they get spikier, but also their chest kind of opens up and you see something inside it. I believe that is the hilt of the knife. That's significant for reasons I'll get to in a minute. But yeah, basically the hilt becomes the core. It somehow becomes the interior of the knife, which I know is a little weird, but I do think there's a reason for it. And then the main body is comprised entirely of the blade, growing outwards and morphing and shifting. Kris's knife in the Light World is not entirely black, most of the time. But when Kris opens a dark fountain, it gets coated in blackness. While we see the dark fountain opening, it looks like this. And what was the thing Ralsei said about darkness, about what they are? When you see something in the dark, it shifts and starts to look different. This is what Kris's knife looks like when it's coated in pure darkness. That's not even conjecture, that's true. We know that's true because we've seen it. We saw it looking like that. It's right there, man. It's in the very the center of the room, which is turned into a dark world. It should be a super significant point of interest within that dark world. It's not like the knife disappears, it doesn't turn into the fountain, because Kris has it again once they re-enter the light world. They either had it the whole time or they pick it back up. There's such a huge deal made of using a sharp object to create a dark fountain. You have to take something sharp and stab it into the ground. Why is there so much importance placed on the sharp thing? It's a plot point Toby pretty much lifted and flipped on its head from Mother 3. In Mother 3, there are needles sticking in the ground and you have to grab them and pull them out. But those needles are not just some random sharp thing. They're incredibly powerful. And it's just hard for me to believe that when that's the basis we're coming from, that the sharp objects in Deltarune are just some random sharp shit with no real significance. I think it's kind of an inversion of Mother 3. It already is, but I think even more so, even more pointedly, if I may. The sharp things in Mother 3 were very powerful, and then they're removed from the ground and robbed of their power. Maybe in Deltarune, the sharp things are powerless and then gain immense power when stuck into the ground. That makes sense, right? I'm not just pulling crazy shit out of nowhere. It just kind of, it sounds right? Like, it feels right. It's possible that the reason the Roaring Night is so powerful inside the Dark Fountains is because it's been used to create them. It's been engulfed in pure darkness, and that grants it a great amount of power. There's also the fact that the significance of an object to a Lightner appears to correlate with their power. King was someone who was very important to Kris as a child, Queen to Noelle. Tenna was extremely important to the entire family. Any particularly powerful Darkner we've encountered, if they weren't given great power by Gaster, is also a thing which meant a lot to the person who sort of created them using their imagination or whatever. If Kris carries this knife around all the time, it's probably their favorite thing. It's their favorite object from what we can tell. They seem to really like it. They seem to think it's like super cool. And I think that would add to the Roaring Knight's power. Although, yeah, I think most of it is coming from the fact that they were used to create the world they exist in and flooded with this energy as it flows out of the ground. They're the very closest thing to it as it's bursting out into the world. Okay, now I said I wasn't going to supply evidence to the contrary of Death Knight or whatever, but I do feel the need to state one thing. Yes, the Lost Girl theme is present in Black Knife, the Roaring Knights theme. I think the reason for that is because we're kind of hearing music from the party's perspective, or from the player's perspective or whatever, the soul's perspective maybe. And I think someone in the party, probably not Kris because they know who the knife is. I guess not Susie or Elsa either because they never met Des. But I think that someone on the player side, maybe even the player themselves, is looking at the knight and being reminded of Des and thinking about Des, and that's why the Lost Girl theme shows up in the Black Knight's theme. I don't know if this makes sense to anyone else. The thing about Deltarune music is that it's non-diegetic, but it has hints of diegesis. It's in some way related to the perspective of the characters, including the player, who is functionally a character in the game. And so I think that perception of the Roaring Knight as being related to Des is influencing the music somewhat, and that's why her theme shows up there. It's like how Mike's theme is comprised of a bunch of other characters' leitmotifs. It's because you go in thinking Mike is going to be somehow related to these other characters, and so that presumption seeps into his theme music. We got it. All the Roaring Knight does in Deltarune is slash and stab things. Its first appearance is it cutting Tenna's arms off. All of its attacks are like sharp object based, or they're cuts. The laser beam looking attack, that's them cutting the screen. It's all related to cutting and stabbing and firing sharp shit at you. That fits Carol, certainly, but Des doesn't seem that into cutting or stabbing. Des likes baseball and playing the guitar and smoking weed with her boyfriend. If the Roaring Knight was Des and hadn't just been completely overwritten with whatever made her like this, I think she'd have some attacks related to Des stuff, and the Knight doesn't really have any. They have this snowflake looking thing, but then it explodes into a bunch of little jagged points, and they don't look like pieces of a snowflake at all. They just look like shards. black shards. Now we do need to talk about the black shard. I don't really remember what to say. Black shard pickup comes later. Take a look at the little floating swords the Roaring Knight uses for most of their attacks, both in and out of battle. Obviously, yeah, they're more jagged blades, but look at the hilt. Notice anything? There's that cross-shaped hilt pattern again, the one that's strikingly similar to Kris's knife. This actually could lend some credence to Carol Knight, as her katana has a similarly shaped hilt. But I think at this point, we all know whose knives they are, whose knife that is. However, it strikes me that another possibility is that this Roaring Knight is Carol's katana in Darknet form, being somehow controlled by Carol. This is possible for basically all the same reasons I think it's possible for it to be Kris's knife. If I am correct, and the Roaring Knight actually is Carol's katana, I'm the fucking smartest guy ever. I'm 100% certain that no one except for me has ever predicted that. And I think it might be. I actually do. Now I'm gonna go over every time the knight or the knife is mentioned in the prophecy. And there's a few. Big thank you to Dak and Jackster on Reddit for compiling the whole prophecy in order, or what they imagine the order to be. Mostly it's very helpful that they just had a list of all the images in a row. First of all, there's Tenna, cleaved red by blade. How literal do we think they're being here? I find this one very exciting because obviously I'm looking at it through Knife Knight lenses, but I do want to point out one thing. When the knight cuts Tenna's arms off, its sword is not drawn. The knight doesn't draw its sword until it enters battle with our party. It may have drawn its sword, slashed Tenna, put the sword away, and drawn the sword again. But there's another reason I don't think that's the case. Look at the attack it launches on Tenna. It's 2 simultaneous slashes. I think it used its hands for those. But the prophecy still says cleaved by blade. And if I'm right about all this, even if the knight used their hands to slash Tenna, that could still be true. Next section of the prophecy, the knight which makes with blackened knife shall duel with heroes strife by strife. The knight, as mentioned in the prophecy here, is Kris. Kris making a dark fountain with blackened knife, like we saw them do at the end of chapter 2. They stabbed their knife into the ground, and the knife was blackened, made black, turned into the black knife, which is the knight, which we'll come back to shortly. Also, look at the hands. They look almost identical to the hands in this part of the prophecy about the first hero, the cage with human soul and parts, which we think is most likely Kris. Might be the vessel. It's probably Kris. The hands look almost identical. They both have these like really pointy, angular fingers. Upon closer inspection, the hands in this part of the prophecy have 5 fingers, and the hands in this part of the prophecy have 4. But the way they're drawn is still pretty similar. And you might be thinking, well, that's just the way hands and fingers are drawn in the prophecy. Maybe so. But it is striking to me that those are the only 2 parts of the prophecy which feature a disembodied pair of hands surrounding an object. They're even angled the same. One hand's the right way up and the other hand's upside down. And ordinarily in these games, when 2 things are designed to be kind of strikingly similar, that means there's some kind of a connection between them. So Toby is either trying to draw parallel between the knight and Kris, which wouldn't be the first time, and there are a number of reasons why he might want to do that, or the implication is that Kris is the knight. And Kris is the knight, so we're going to go with that interpretation. And this part of the prophecy, I believe, actually puts a dent in Carol Knight theory. The phrasing of the prophecy is so specific. Blackened knife. And unless Carol has like a smaller knife, like a wakizashi that she's using to create portals, the level of importance that appears to have been placed on Carol's love of katanas makes me think those are probably the sharp objects she's using to create the Dark Fountain. And aside from the fact that referring to a katana as a knife would be not only inaccurate, but also terribly offensive to the Japanese, it also doesn't make sense to say that her knife was blackened, because Carol's katana, as we've seen, already is black. Unless it was made black by the process of opening the Dark Fountain, which I don't think happened, because that hasn't happened to Kris's knife. Kris's knife in the light world is still regular knife colors. Her katana is already black. It's impossible to blacken something which is already black. God, I'm fucking so 100% on this theory. When I started recording this, I was like, I think it's probably Des, but I also think this is an interesting possibility. And the more I like rewatch the fight and look at the knight's design and stuff, the more I'm thinking like, oh damn, no, I'm like 100% right about this. How am I the first person to think of this? Kris makes a deliberate point of hiding the knife from us. They don't mention it being on their person when we look in the inventory. Why do they do that? What's the importance of that? I guess if they're opening dark fountains with it, they wouldn't want us to know about it, but we already do because we've seen them do it. So I don't think it's that. I think it's more that Kris wants us to forget they have the knife, so we don't go into the Dark Worlds thinking, well, where's the knife? They conceal it from us in their inventory in the Light World, so that we'll assume they're doing the same thing in the Dark World. It's just a thing you're unable to register in the inventory. When the reality is that once they enter the Dark World, the knife is no longer on their person, because it's off being the knight, being the knife knight. I will add on to this that I think Kris is directly controlling the knight. I don't think they're working with the knight. I think they are directly in control of the knight's every action. Kris gets stressed out over the course of the fight, and that could be because they're afraid of Susie and Ralsei defeating them and messing up their plans, or their friends finding out their true intentions. But it's an extremely physical reaction. They start breathing heavily and sweating. They start to develop a migraine. It could be because of stress, but I also think it could be because they're really straining themselves to control this thing as they're fighting. When you use the hold breath command in battle, the knight's actions become slower. And I think most players interpreted that as when Kris holds their breath and calms down and focuses, it becomes easier to dodge the attacks. I think it may be more literal than that. I think when Kris holds their breath, the oxygen supply is cut off to their brain, and that makes it harder to multitask, harder to fight and to control the knight at the same time, and that's why the knight's actions slow down. I mentioned how I believe the hilt of the knife is kind of stored within the knight. I think that's related to how Kris is controlling it, either symbolically or literally. You wield a knife by holding its handle, and so if the handle is at the heart of the knife, it's kind of controlling its every action. Kris would be somehow spiritually, psychically, I don't know, holding on to that to control them. I think the hilt is kind of, in an abstract way, the knife knight's soul. And so like how we control the soul, which controls Kris controls the hilt, which controls the knife that is the knight. Many people have made mention of the fact that the Roaring Knight appears to imitate a lot of Kris's moves. Or Kris imitates theirs. This could be because it's Des, and Kris and Des grew up together, and Kris grew up idolizing Des and wanting to be like her. Or it could just be because Kris isn't a very good actor. When the knight acts or poses, does anything cool, that's just Kris doing their own regular motions. This is Kris's real, cool, edgy self-insert, not Ralsei. I've been saying the Roaring Knight in air quotes this whole video. That's because I don't think it is the Roaring Knight. I don't think it is creating the Dark Fountains. Or I guess it is, but it's not really consciously doing that. It's not in control of itself doing that. We believe it's the Roaring Knight, but the only so-called confirmation we have of that is that at the start of the battle, the text at the bottom of the screen reads, "The Roaring Knight appeared." I think Kris is the one telling us that. Kris wants us to believe that this is the Roaring Knight, the one causing the roaring, because it's useful as a decoy to them. If they can present to the party and to the player that this single entity is the Roaring Knight, then that takes suspicion off of them and Carol and Asgore and whoever else may be working with them. Outside of this one line of narration, the narrative of Deltarune never refers to this character as the Roaring Knight. The narrative, or to be more precise, the meta-narrative, the stuff outside of the story which still contains information about the story, only calls them one thing. This character's boss theme is titled Black Knife. I remember seeing a tweet or a post somewhere that was like, why does Toby keep calling swords knives? Why does he refer to any sharp object as a knife? In this case, I think there's something more to it than that. I don't think the blade that this character wields is the black knife. The weapon you get from the Roaring Knight fight, the fragment that chips off their blade, is called the Black Shard, and its flavor text describes it as a shard of the black knife. But remember earlier when I said the Roaring Knight's whole body appears to be one singular piece, including their weapon, the blade that grows out of them? The Black Shard is a piece of the Roaring Knight. That's why it becomes the Black Knife in the Dark World, because it's been doing that the whole time. People have completely convinced themselves that the Roaring Knight is definitely Des, either because they're absolutely certain it's the case, or because they think any other answer to the question of the Knight's identity would be unsatisfying. If they're not even a character, it's just Kris's knife, it's just an item. That could be disappointing for some people, but not to me, because I wouldn't mind the big Chapter 3 reveal being a misdirect. I don't think the big reveal surrounding this character is the Roaring Knight's true identity. I think it's that this is not the Roaring Knight. As many certain agenda pushers on Twitter have been saying, I think the Roaring Knight really is a fraud, because they're not the Roaring Knight at all. The design is super cool, absolutely, but I do believe that could be a ploy on both Toby's part and Kris's part to distract the player into thinking there's something more significant than they actually are. And that doesn't disappoint me, because it means we get the true reveal of where Des is and who's been opening all the dark fountains and all these other questions later on. So I guess I don't think the Roaring Knight is Kris's knife, because I don't think this is the Roaring Knight. I think it's a smokescreen, a wave of darkness thrown in front of our eyes to distract us from the real questions we ought to be asking. Shout out to my friends Leo and Drag, who've become my kind of designated jabber about Deltarune with buddies since the recent chapters came out. Big thanks to my brother Nov for drawing the thumbnail. He did a tremendous job, and you can check out an alternative take on the thumbnail that we didn't end up using in the video, which I think on its own, as a piece of art, looks even better. I prefer the other one for the purposes of being a YouTube thumbnail. Huge special thanks to Shirako on YouTube for the full-length playthroughs of Chapter 3 and 4 that I used for footage in this video. I would have recorded my own gameplay, but I was in a hurry to get this done, so his playthroughs were a massive help. If you enjoyed my video, please do stick around. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave a comment, you know the drill. I plan on making a lot more videos like this one. Also, Eram is mare spelled backwards, so the bit is that you fight the knight and the mare in the same chapter, and that's why that thing's called Eram. That's all, bye.
Tails and Knuckles are dead.
What I'm going to propose today is that maybe we don't need to throw out all our old knight theories just yet. Maybe, just maybe, there's still a kernel of truth to be found among the dead. Maybe two things can be true at the same time. Maybe, just maybe, the night can be both December holiday and a literal black knife.
Man, this theory's insane. How the fuck did someone beat me to it?